Mark Frank has a great sense of timing. He graduated from West Point just in time for 9/11, and he had a summer job at Lehman soon before its collapse. Then a few years ago, he had an insight that a mental health wave was coming. As stigma fell, mental health parity rules took effect, and as stresses increased. He co-founded SonderMind, where as CEO, he's helping make behavioral health more accessible, approachable, and utilized. The company's had great success and has plenty of room to grow before running out of opportunities to improve the system. In this episode of the HealthBiz podcast, Mark describes how his upbringing in Atlanta, Japan, and Germany shaped how he looked at the world and how family members have influenced his enlistment in the military and his path with SonderMind. I'm your host, David Williams, and I hope you enjoy the show. Meanwhile, if your healthcare or life sciences business needs strategy consulting, I'd be happy to discuss. We have 2 decades of experience in developing robust strategies for telehealth and remote patient monitoring companies whose strategic opportunities and challenges are similar to SonderMinds. You can reach me at dwilliams@healthbusinessgroup.com. Mark Frank, welcome to the HealthBiz podcast.
Thanks. I'm happy to be part of this.
Listen, we're going to get into a lot about what you're doing now, but I want to start out with your background, your upbringing, and we'll sort of slowly work into the present day. So, tell me a little bit about your childhood and any particular influences that stand out. Anything that we should know about?
My childhood was probably not the norm for most American children. I was born in Atlanta, and when I was 6, I moved to Tokyo. My dad worked for IBM, so lived there for 3 years, right downtown Tokyo. I went to an American school, but that was obviously really a different culture, a completely different culture, and just really seeing things from a different lens. And then I moved back to Atlanta for 2 years, and then I moved to Germany for 2.5, 3 years after that. And then it's the same thing. And my mom actually happens to be German. And then I moved back to Atlanta, and I finished out my high school time, middle school and high school, or end of middle school and high school in Atlanta. And so, I think that some of the influences just moving around and seeing different cultures and being really subject to pretty drastic change as a child, in a positive way, but it influences you. And I think it made me a lot more comfortable with change and uncertainty as an adult, even though maybe as a kid I didn't always love it. But there was this other aspect. Actually, we always moved back to the same house. So the house that my parents live in today is the house that they brought me home to from the hospital when I was born. And so that's also kind of unique in and of itself. It's just, the moving back and forth, but always back to the same house.
It sounds like you have a solid anchor point, but then some pretty big swings between Japan, Germany, and so on. I've just interviewed somebody for the podcast, the CEO of a company called Proprio, and he spent some formative time in Japan, not as a child, but of his own volition after studying Japanese in school. And we actually touched on that because the Japanese perspective is really so different. Especially as the world is homogenized, Japan then and still now, it's very different to be there.
Very, very different. I mean, the Eastern culture and Western culture are so different. I mean, you could say Germany and the United States are different, but those are shades of differences. Japan is very different than the United States.
Great. So then it sounds like you went to West Point, and your timing was auspicious in the sense that you managed to finish up just before 9/11.
That's
so
right.
What was that all about?
Well, I went to West Point, and my dad had been in the Army before I was born. My older sister, who was a little more than a decade older than me, had enlisted in the Army. We didn't come from a lot of means, and so she enlisted in the Army, served for a couple of years active duty, and then got her undergrad, and it was paid for by the GI Bill. So I was and when I was in Germany, 2 of my 3 years I'd gone to school on the Army base as an expat. So I was exposed to the military. West Point it was really about, it was a leadership academy. I mean, that's what it is, right? You go there to learn how to lead people. And I wanted to do that. And so I was always drawn to leadership, even at a relatively young age, in junior high and in high school. And I thought, this is what I want to do when I'm older. I didn't know what industry necessarily and things like that. So that was, that was part of the impetus for going there. When I entered West Point in the mid 90s, and we were in arguably one of the most peaceful times in world history at that point.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. It
And
was like the end of history, right? It was just like
yeah,
sustained peace and prosperity,
yeah, it
the
was
peace
like
dividend and all that kind of thing.
exactly right. And
Yeah,
so, it was a really interesting time, and I think the shift that people in my class and one or two years above and below me who entered West Point or the military for that matter pre 9/11, but then served through deployments things like that. It was again like this huge upheaval. It's very different than somebody who entered West Point in 2004, right? Like you knew what you were getting into. You
right.
knew there was a conflict in Iraq. You knew, and there were tens of thousands of troops there, Afghanistan. So you knew absolutely that you were going to be deployed. For those of us who that wasn't the case, it was like, oh, I don't know, and even just the teaching and the mindset and the things you talked about uh, in school, right, as a cadet, was just very different. So I found it really interesting. I remember I deployed during Operation Iraqi Freedom One. So that was the initial invasion. So even that was like total uncertainty. I mean, we deployed thinking we would be back stateside in 6 months. That
Right.
we thought it was going to be a rehash of Desert Storm One, right? You go in there, you're there for a little bit, and then everybody's back, and there's no more troops there. That was wrong, obviously.
Yeah, right.
My battalion commander, who now is actually fairly well known, he's General Gustav Perna. He's the COO of Operation Warp Speed. It's a four-star general. So this whole
Yeah.
COVID deployment, he was my battalion commander, my lieutenant colonel when we deployed, and I remember him telling me, "Mark, it's okay. You can sell your house," because I was supposed to go to the captain's course about 4 months after we went to Iraq. Uh, and he said, "You can sell your house. Tell your wife it's okay. She can quit her job, and you'll be back by June." This was 2003. And one of the hardest conversations I ever had to have in my life was calling my wife about 2 weeks before I was supposed to be home, 3 months after I deployed, saying, "I'm not coming home." And, "Well, when are you coming home?" "I don't know." "Well,
Yeah.
should I get my job back?" Because she was a nurse. "Should I just, I just gave my 2 weeks notice yesterday."
Right.
I said, "Yeah, get your job back because I don't know how long it'll be."
And did she sell the house too while she was at it, or
Luckily, it was not as strong a market as it is these days, and so the house
thank goodness for
was
something?
yeah, it was on the market for 8 weeks and it didn't sell. That wouldn't happen anymore until she was able to pull it off. But yeah, it was a really interesting time, and I found from a leadership standpoint, it was obviously extremely formative, not just deployment and leading troops in a combat environment, but more just everything leading up to it, and again having people who didn't necessarily, we had troops who were like, "I didn't sign up for this," even though you did because you knew it was a
Right.
hypothetical possibility. But if you enlisted in 1999, you didn't think that there was a scenario you would be shooting people or getting shot at.
Yeah. So in '05 you were discharged,
Yep.
and then what?
And then I went to business school, and I actually was not sure that I even wanted to go to business school. So I had gotten a master's while I was in the army, pre-Iraq. I had gotten a master in computer information systems. That was my undergrad was in computer science, and I got a real estate license when I came back. I was interested in real estate, so I was always interested in that. I gotten a bartending, not a license, but I'd gone to the bartending academy for for 4 weeks and learned how to make drinks and things like that. And I said, well, maybe I'll try this out. I was always interested in business and then just how companies worked and things like that. So ended up applying to a number of business schools and actually chose Kellogg predominantly because I decided I did not want to go into finance. Specifically, I did not want to go into investment banking. I read a book called Monkey Business and another one called Liar's Poker, and those two books
Yeah.
could have shied me away from the institutional security side, investment banking, which is what Monkey Business focused on, and then sales and trading. And I said, I'm going to do consulting. So I went to Kellogg and I did an internship before I started business school with a guy who had done consulting for 20 plus 30 years, management consulting. And his last part of his year had been a lot of M&A last part of his career has been M&A integration. And so he was actually at a firm that was an M&A advisory shop. It was an investment bank. But I didn't know that because I was coming out of the army. I didn't know anything. So I said, well, I'll work with this guy before I start business school. And I realized I was really interested in M&A. I thought it was super interesting. And here was a person who I trusted. He was a West Point grad, an HBS grad. And he said, Mark, you could do consulting, but your DNA is one that you probably will get a little frustrated by the lack of closure and execution around consulting projects. He's like, I thought it was great and really intellectually stimulating, but it was for me, but I don't think it'll necessarily be for you. So that steered me away a little bit from consulting, and that opened my eyes up to some other industries. And so I ended up jumping into investment banking actually just for the summer to try it out.
Yeah.
Did my summer at Lehman Brothers in 2006.
Nice. Yeah, you were just that's good you didn't stick with that one for another couple of years, right?
It's
So,
funny. Everybody
yeah.
says, "Well, how did you know not to take your offer from Lehman and go to Morgan
Yeah,
Stanley?" And
right.
did you see something that was going on? Did you think that this was all going to collapse? I said, no, of course I didn't see anything. I
Yeah.
I wanted to do healthcare, and my wife at the time was a nurse and had been as a nurse practitioner, and I was interested in healthcare, and the head of the Morgan Stanley healthcare practice led the Chicago office. I also would prefer to stay in Chicago, and Morgan Stanley, one of the few bulge brackets in Chicago, did full M&A execution out of the Chicago office. So I could get to do healthcare, do full execution for M&A. I'll do some coverage, and that was the choice. And so, there was nothing special about not going to Lehman.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's good because you seem to know how to call them a couple of years in advance. We'll see. So at Kellogg, so what was it like being a combat vet there in business school?
It was great. I mean, there's a really strong veterans community. At most of the business schools, they have veterans associations, veterans clubs. For the time that I was there, 2005, 2007, there weren't that many of us. There were a handful of veterans, but there weren't as many who had been in the company. So actually, I attribute my experience in the military to how I got into investment banking. A lot of it because I think people just wanted to hear in the interview process. When you're interviewing for your internship and for your full time roles, and you've got VPs and whatnot that are interviewing MBA students, I had interesting stories. And I could talk about things that wasn't, I did consulting at Deloitte for 4 years, and I was at this, I was an analyst in investment banking or whatever, or I was an accountant or something like that. And so I think I was a rarity. There weren't a lot of other,
Yeah.
you know, guys who had been in Iraq who were applying. Fast forward 3-4 years, littered with people, because there were just that many more deployments over the between 2003 to 2008, 2009.
Yeah, I graduated from college in 1989, and Operation Desert Storm was occurred, within a year of that. So when I went to business school, I graduated in '94, started in '92.
Hmm.
There were a number of veterans of the first Gulf War that were there, and it was kind of a new thing at HBS. Certainly, they had military people, and they go back to having had roles in World War II and World War One, but since probably before the Vietnam era, it was a kind of a new class of people to have there, and I think it was maybe they learned something from it by the time you got to business school. But it was an interesting experience for
Yeah.
sure. So let's bring it to the present. SonderMind.
Yeah.
So what need did you see? Why SonderMind? And
So,
what should we worry about 2 years from now, given your previous experience starting wars and collapsing investment banks?
so SonderMind, I when I left investment banking, I I went into healthcare as an operator. I started a company that was in radiation oncology, treating patients with brain tumors, lung cancer, prostate cancer. So it became a management service organization, and a couple of the companies that I co-founded around the same time as that, while I was running Next Oncology and building that up. And I saw a couple things, but it really started, from a chronological order. It actually started first with my sister. So my younger sister is a licensed professional counselor. She's a therapist. And so I had seen her go from, undergrad to her master's program to then working in an employed setting as a therapist, and then jumping into private practice after about 4 or 5 years. And that was always her goal. Her goal going into this field was, I want to be, my own boss, and I want to have my private practice, and I want to treat clients. And the struggles that she had in starting and growing her private practice were immense. And I remember talking to her, and I'm running a management service organization. I'm very familiar with the fact that across healthcare, there are slews of companies that are focused on taking off the plate all the things that aren't providing clinical care for providers, right? And sort of professionalizing, and I don't mean that in a clinical sense, but I mean that in like a business sense, various verticals and industries within healthcare. And I remember talking to her and saying, well, if you're having a hard time getting clients, Why don't you go and network with the insurance companies? Now, this was back in like 2010. Insurance
Yeah.
companies they had their behavioral health networks were, quote, closed. And so she said, I tried, and they say no. But then she said, even beyond that, I don't know how to do billing and collections. I don't know how to get in network and do this credentialing stuff. And it's just me. I don't have a staff. I don't have a receptionist. It's just I don't want to, and I don't want to do that. I don't want to spend my. That's why I didn't go into this field to do that. And the rates aren't that great. And I said, but there's got to be organizations that do that, MSOs or independent provider associations, IPAs, things like that. And so I had that idea kind of back in my head. Fast forward a few years, I I experienced my own just struggle with trying to find a therapist and trying to use my in-network insurance benefits, partially because I knew the system and I was just stubborn. I didn't want to pay out of pocket. I could have afforded probably 125, 150 dollars a session, but I wanted to use my insurance benefits, and I knew how the system was supposed to work. And so, you go on the insurance directory, you put in your zip code, you say I'm looking for a therapist, you click the box that's accepting new clients, and then you call the first one because there's no information. You don't know if they're a good fit. And they don't answer. And you leave a message and you wait for a call back and they don't call back. And you call the next one and she answers, but she says she's not taking clients anymore. And the next one isn't taking insurance clients anymore, but says you can pay out of pocket, which you're not supposed to do if you're in network. And on it goes. And even to the point where it's like, okay, you finally find that, unicorn who is taking new clients, accepts your insurance, and has some availability, but then they go, actually, I don't deal with the stuff you're dealing with. You're like, oh my God, this is so challenging. And so finally found somebody, great clinician, a really good provider. But even beyond that, the consumer experience was just really challenging. You trying to pay with your copay, you got to pay write a check and try to reschedule an appointment, and it's really a pain. And it's in a little basement office with no windows, and I was like, gosh, this is here are these two problems, these two sides of the marketplace, right? You have the provider side, so it's supply side, therapist side, and I saw these problems that my sister was facing. And then you have the client side, which I had seen and I knew about from others, and so I started digging more. And I was fortunate. My older cousin is a clinical psychologist. She's about a year older than me. We're very close, and her husband's a psychiatrist. So I had actually a pretty good network to go to, not just them, but their colleagues, and start to really dig in and understand what are the problems that you're facing as providers. And that all came maybe with back to sort of like seeing a little bit into the future. I started seeing in 2011, 2012. I remember talking to a lot of people and saying, you guys see this wave that's coming, this huge wave of mental health problem? And it was triggered maybe by my understanding of reading through the Affordable Care Act and reading through the Parity Act and saying, this is going to be addressed. There's research that shows this is how you reduce population health costs. This is how you can improve overall physical wellness, not just mental wellness, but physical wellness can be improved by this. And it's being destigmatized. I remember, seeing somebody, I think in the patient waiting room or something like that, watching at the oncology company, the Desperate Housewives or something like that, right? One of the or the Beverly Hills Housewives of whatever, right? And
Yeah.
and these people who are interesting people, and you can say what you will about them, but they're like, I'm going to my therapist here and I'm going to my psychiatrist there, and they were talking about mental health in a way that was not with any sense of shame, which is how it should be that way, right? But that was 10 years ago, 9 years ago, that was not the case generally in the populace. And so I started seeing it, life sometimes imitates art, right? And not that I would call those shows art, but the pop culture sort of like, I think this is going to trickle down. So there's going to be a stigma reduction. There's going to be more focus from health insurance companies and from health systems who are now taking on more risk. And we have to build something that solves the problems for the therapists. And by doing so, we can provide a much better solution for the client.
No, it sounds, spot on, certainly in retrospect. I know, I notice in the younger generation, let's say teens, completely, it's almost everyone has a
Yeah,
therapist, and it's almost like you have a phone, you have a phone, you put that out there, and you have a therapist, you have that, and so the stigma is totally, gone. You feel maybe there's something wrong with you if you don't
that's
have a
right.
therapist. And then I had, actually helped somebody to find a therapist, and, they said they got 2 names from their doctor, and they called them, and, nobody called
Yeah.
them back, and it's like, "Give me 30 names." And I called all 30, And because I knew it was sort of like what you had described, and you had the whole panoply of not taking patients. Maybe they're going to have an opening at some point. Insurance, I don't know. And then never mind, did they actually deal with this type of thing, which had to do with
Yeah.
adolescence, and that's just
Yeah.
crazy. And this is today. This is
That's right.
2021. So no doubt some opportunities. So where do you go, from here? Like, how do you actually get your arms around? So the problem is there, what's the solution? And you're not going to solve it all at once. So how do you figure out if you're making progress? Okay, what are the indicators? Because there's also not a lot of quality
That's
indicators as far as
that's
I can
exactly
tell.
right. Our mission, SonderMind's mission, is to redesign mental and behavioral health through improved access, utilization, and clinical outcomes. And we take each of those three tenets: access, utilization of care, and clinical outcomes, equally important. So for us, we measure quality. So there are clinically validated assessments that patients can fill out, things like GAD-7 for anxiety, PHQ-9, which is a 9-question questionnaire for depression. There's things for maternal mental health, postpartum depression, things like that. So those are clinically objective measurements of quality and care, because you can see how patients are tracking toward it. I actually would argue that that's a little suspect, because it's a self-reported questionnaire, right? So in my opinion, I'm kind of a data guy. It's not totally objective, because it's driven by somebody answering questions, but it's kind of some of the best things we have right now. Our vision is really to say, hey, let's take those sort of objective, subjective, maybe they're on the fence, subjective, objective measures. Let's take very subjective measures, like just how are you feeling today, kind of mood tracking type things. Let's take very objective measures, right? How many visits did you have with a clinician? How was the length of stay? What are other comorbidities or things like that that are impacted or not, or being improved upon? And let's pull all that together to actually build a quality score, which is what we do. So we have this quality scoring mechanism, and that allows us to actually then understand, hey, who are the providers who are high quality? But it's not an objective, you're a good provider, you're a bad provider. What is often the case is that, hey, you're a great therapist for the adolescent, ages 13 to 19, dealing with this and that and the other. Maybe you're not that great for the senior citizen who's trying to deal with empty nester syndrome, right? Like, totally different demographics, right? Even if it was the same sort of issue type or clinical diagnosis, if you will. So that's something that's really unique to mental health, because in physical health, you have an entire education system and testing system and fellowships and boards and things like that that point doctors into the direction of who are they treating, and what demographic are they treating? Are you pediatrician or geriatric, right? And what body type are they treating, right? Are you are you a urologist? Are you internal medicine? Are you a neurologist? Are you a surgeon? So even it's like patient type, anatomy, often diagnosis, right? You have people who do infectious disease, things like that, oncologists, right? So there's
Yeah.
all these specialties that are very regimented. Like you wouldn't go to a urologist and say, hey, let me also check out and see what's going on in your brain scan. You're like, no, 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 wrong part of the body, doc, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so, but in mental health, generally speaking, it's sort of just open field, right? Now, most providers
Yeah.
don't do everything, and they don't see everybody, and they regulate themselves. But as an individual looking for care, you don't know who's good or bad at what, and if they're just starting out at that thing, and maybe they've been a provider for 20 years, but they're just trying to do a new area. And as a referring physician, right? If you're a primary care physician or something like that, like you said, a doctor that says, hey, here's a couple names of some folks. You may know that because you've got some anecdotal evidence, but you don't have sort of really like broad, high end size data driven evidence that this provider is really good at this and that and the other, and that one's not. So that's part of what we view our vision is to really move the industry forward by giving a lot more data and credence to how providers can manage it and be quality, because we believe that they already are. We just want to orient the right client or right patient to them.
So here we are, and going into the second year of the pandemic, or we should call it. I don't know. We want to say when we make the Gulf War analogy, but in the first major pandemic of the
I
21st
know.
century here, and to be followed by the second one shortly, I
Yeah.
assume. But what are the new issues that are arising? I'm sure we're going to talk about telehealth. So, but what are you seeing certainly in terms of, I think mental health stresses are reasonably well
Yep.
documented from the pandemic. There's a big move to telehealth, but, sort of beyond that, the headlines, what are you seeing, and is telehealth a panacea?
So let me. What I actually look back on the last year and maybe look forward on hopefully only in the next 6 months or so, and hopefully we come out of this, with some herd immunity sooner than later, maybe before the end of 2021. So that's my hope, but that's just as a citizen here. Uh,
Yeah.
I think the pandemic really has had two pretty negative consequences for our mental health, or driven by. One is the social isolation, right? I mean, we are social creatures. Evolution has created us as such, and so having the lack of engagement with others in the way that we are biologically equipped and to a certain degree mandated to has been very impactful for people, and and so and all that has done is aggravated other stressors, right? And so if you were in a low level of depression, there's a high likelihood that you are now in a high level of depression, that you're at a clinical level of depression. So that's one of the huge, we're going to be, we've dug ourselves into a hole with this pandemic from a mental health standpoint. And then the other is actually, people generally don't process change really well. Um, you actually saw it, if you think about just anecdotally, kind of consider the people you worked with, that you socialized with a year ago, right? Let's say March of 2020, March to May of 2020. There was a lot of pushback, right, against wearing masks. And let's take off the political piece of it, right? And let's just think about
Yeah.
just inherent, like, do we do this thing? And I don't want to change how I'm going to, people weren't like, do I really need a social distance? Are we really not going to go into the office? And our school's really going to be shut down, all this sort of stuff. Fast forward just 8 or 9 months, right? And it's the opposite, right? People are like, you have to wear it everywhere. You have to, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm really worried about my kids going into school. I really don't want to go into the office. I'm worried about it. This is because we're equipped. We want chaos. We want to manage the chaos by putting order in place, and change is chaos, right? And so just in our own animal brain. So that's the other impact, is just the immense amount of change that we've had over the last year because of the pandemic and what's going to continue to happen. So I think those are the negatives that have really negatively impacted and exacerbated the mental health crisis that was already in existence in our country. One of the positives, though, to look for some silver lining, is the stigma reduction. We just talked about that, right? The kids, they maybe a generation, of 15 to 25-year-olds, there wasn't that much stigma. But I would say that the amount of people who now, who are in their 50s and 60s, who would have never spoken about therapy, are willing to speak about it, is dramatic. It's dramatically different than a year ago. And we were already on a really good slope, kind of from stigma being reduced over the last 5-10 years, but it has accelerated it tremendously. So that's a real positive, I think, that's come out of the pandemic.
So telehealth, fan?
I am, but I don't see it as a panacea, to use your words. So we have always built the business on this idea that we're here to provide excellent care. We're here to enable our therapists to provide the best possible high quality outcomes as network providers for clients in need of care. Now, if you say, me, therapist, the best way I can do that for this client is in person, okay. If another one says the best way I can do that is over video, okay. But the reality is, most providers say, hey, a mix is actually the best, because sometimes that client can't make it in. Yeah, I'm in Denver. We just had a snowstorm last week. School was canceled on Thursday last week. People, let's say if this wasn't COVID, when people were just used to not going anywhere anyway, they would have canceled appointments, right? Or a therapist would have canceled them. Now what happens? They can keep them, right? They can keep that care schedule going. You can provide, telehealth opens up access points for people in other markets, right? In rural areas, as an example, where there might not be a high population of therapists. Or more specifically, there might not be a high population of therapists who focus on each of those individual needs, right? Like if you go in rural markets, there might be a primary care doctor, but you have to go into the city to see the oncologist, right? If you're out in who knows where Montana, you got to go into Billings to go get your oncology treatment. You can't have it out in the middle of nowhere. Uh, Therapy kind of similar. It opens up that accessibility and it increases utilization. So our view, in my view, is that ultimately we'll see this hybridization. This is where we consider ourselves a fully hybrid model, right? Our therapists offer in person, they offer text therapy all on our platform, they offer video all on our platform, and so it's about getting appropriate care, not the modality of care. There's the risk, though, as we see now in this environment, even in a work environment. I sent an article to my company about Zoom fatigue. Right? There's a lot of research around this, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's just the the lack of ability to get up and walk around, the lack of sort of human interaction that happens when you're in person, is tiring. So I think that there's actually going to be higher burnout propensity for therapists who are engaging in in full video, full telehealth practice environments.
I can believe that. So how's your business going?
It's been going great. I mean, we've been on a really strong growth curve for the past 2 or 3 years. It's interesting. I actually say that 2020 for us had probably as many headwinds as it had tailwinds. So again, at this time last year, and we're at the beginning of March 2021. So in beginning of March 2020, all of our therapy from all of our therapists, or I'll say like 98%, was delivered in person.
Yeah.
So what did we do? So and by April, in the month of April 2020, 93% of all of our therapy was delivered over our video. It was over a video platform, and we had been building our own platform for a few months, about 6 months previous to that. So we'd already made it. We had actually already launched our text messaging platform, for text therapy. But the change that created for us as a business was challenging, and we've grown materially from a headcount standpoint. So the company has increased threefold, where the vast majority of those new hires have been hired in a remote environment. All that said, we're treating now tens of thousands of clients every month, and we have thousands of providers. And almost all of our providers, or almost all of our clients, are utilizing their in-network insurance benefits, right? And so we're achieving that mission, right? We're achieving the ability to provide improved access, improved utilization of care, and we're tracking quality outcomes. So we can definitively say when a patient comes in the door with a clinical level of depression, in less than 10 weeks, they will have a subclinical level of depression. And that's across our entire population, and other, I'll just use as an example, and other sort of forms of tracking quality.
Great. I have to ask, what does the name mean, SonderMind?
So when I was founding, so Sean Boyd was my co-founder. He's a therapist himself, and when we were founding the company, we wanted to find something that, this is back in 2014. The stigma thing was real then. And again, it's still real now, but it was really real then. We didn't want a word that was like psych or thera or counsel or any of these things that just put you right into that stigma bucket. And we didn't want to go all the way in the other direction of, hey, we want something that's wellness, very like kind of holistic, your health, just like too
Yeah.
nondescript. So mind was actually the first. Mind is like that's it. We like the mind piece.
Yeah.
And
Mind
then
is good.
Sonder has these two etymologies, right? In German, it means special, and in French, it means essentially to probe. So when you kind of think about our business model, we have we have two sets of customers, right? We have clients and therapists, and our clients have a special mind, and our therapists are probing the mind, right? What is therapy if not probing in the mind, right? And so it was a really kind of nice mix of what we were really aiming to do.
No, it's good. I wonder if you did a survey, what people would think about it. I could see, it's like SonderMind, but we took the U
That's
out
the
of
first
it.
thing my dad said.
Or
That's exactly.
yeah, or SonderMind, we sort of sanded the mind down, or
Yeah.
you can go from there. But anyway, it's a good name, and I think relatively easy to spell for people. So that's good. Well, let me just shift on to my last question that I ask everybody who's a guest here, And what are you reading these days?
Today, I'm in the middle of a book called 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. It's by Jordan Peterson. A recommendation from, as actually a gift from somebody, and I got the gift about 3 weeks before I got a recommendation from one of my board members. It's great. I just finished, a couple weeks ago, I finished You Should Talk to Somebody by Lori Gottlieb. And before that, a book called Range, which was a really interesting book about specialists and generalists. And then the next on the list, I have to look at it because I don't want to mess up the name, is a gift I got from somebody. I try to shift kind of the genres a little bit. The next one is A Story of Family Fine Bourbon and the Things That Last, Pappyland. So it's about the Pappy Van Winkle, the really good bourbon. So I haven't started reading yet, but that was a gift from one of my team members.
Yeah, good. So we were chatting before the show, and it sounds like you've got a challenge in the household to read a certain number of books, and you're on track. But you enjoy being
being
on track,
and I enjoy reading, although it's definitely busy. Running a company and trying to grow and trying to achieve the mission that we're trying to achieve here.
Great. Well, Mark Frank, co-founder and CEO of SonderMind, thank you very much for your time and your insights today.
Thank you. Oh, it's really great to be on.
You've been listening to the HealthBiz podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.